In this video, we're going to look at a different type of favoritism. Usually when we think about this issue, we think about discrimination, and we think about looking down on someone who we have deemed as somehow less than us, and because we look down on them, we treat them poorly. And this certainly is a very prevalent aspect of favoritism. We see it all over the place in our society. Again, I think many of us, if we're honest with ourselves, would probably say that we have been guilty of this at some point in our lives. But this certainly isn't the only type of favoritism. And in fact, when James gives us a practical illustration of what this might look like, he points us in kind of a different direction, points us toward this different type of favoritism. After starting off in verse 1 saying that as Christians we shouldn't exercise favoritism, look at the example that he gives of what this might look like starting in verse 2. He says, "Suppose a man comes into your meeting, and he's wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. He says, if you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes," and then he goes on and says that if you do that and you bring him to a nice seat in the front of the building and you tell the poor guy to sit on the floor, he says, well, if you've done that, that is favoritism. And at first glance, we might not notice the difference here, but really what James is describing is not just treating the lesser, those who are in the lower class of society poorly, but actually the danger is giving special attention to the rich. You see, I think James wants us to understand that favoritism is not just treating people that we have decided are less than us in a negative way, but it's also seen when we give undue attention and adulation to those who we have deemed as somehow better than us or in the upper echelon of society. You see, you might assume that James uses this example because in the church there that he was talking to these Christians, that maybe what was happening was these poor people were coming in and they were just treating them poorly because they were a pretty well-to-do church and they didn't want it to be all muddied up with the riffraff. But in fact, it was just the opposite. The people to which James was writing, they were quite poor. They were persecuted. Many of them were homeless. They were the poor ones described in the verse. And so you can imagine how excited they would be, this group of poor people, when somebody with means, somebody with wealth comes into their congregation and seems like they might be a part of this church. Of course, they would be excited. They'd be tripping all over themselves to try to give this person special attention and to invite them to come be a part of their gathering. You see, what James is addressing is that these people were actually selfishly seeking to benefit personally from the rich person. I imagine these people had in mind, oh, good, we're suffering, we're starving as a church, and here is somebody who can help us. Here is somebody who can help us out of our difficult situation. Now, you can understand where they're coming from. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes sense that you'd want to have people within the church helping one another. And yet James comes after them and says, if you fawn all over the wealthy, if you give special attention to the rich, well, then you are guilty of favoritism. And I think that, again, if we're honest with ourselves, we can probably see us doing this in many aspects of our lives. These days, we might call it sucking up or brown-nosing or, trying to get in good with people, hoping that somehow you're going to experience some positive effect from being around them. Maybe it will increase your own reputation. Maybe they'll be generous with you. Maybe they're going to help you out in some way, give you a leg up in your career, whatever it might be. But what the Bible is teaching us here is that if we view people simply as a means of personal gain, if we suck up to them, if we try to show extra special attention to them because it might benefit us in some way, that is just as evil as looking down on people and treating them poorly. So what James is doing here is bringing us back to the core definition of what it means to show favoritism, that it is judging people, whether positively or negatively, based on external characteristics. And he's teaching us that we shouldn't look down on the lowly and we shouldn't fawn all over the wealthy and the powerful in our society either. So why don't you pause for a second now and discuss these questions?